We'll go ahead and get started. First, I just want to thank you all for joining us and welcome you. Today, we are discussing bank stabilization techniques for wild and scenic rivers. This is the fifth in a series of 6 webinars that we're doing right now on wild and scenic rivers. And right now, just as people are joining, I'm going to be putting a series of links to handouts. I'm going to be continuously putting these into the chat, but these will be things that you'll want to be opening up because as you'll see, we'll be going into some case studies later on, and these will be useful. Just a quick note for those who might not be familiar, this is being hosted by the River Management Society's River Training Center. RMS is a membership-based organization. We bring together a whole diverse community of river professionals, including river managers, scientists, educators, agency personnel, stakeholders, students, with the goal of protecting and enhancing North America's rivers and supporting those who do so. So we do this through workshops, training. We have a whole bunch of resources, as you can see on the screen, for members. And so if you aren't familiar, I encourage you to go over to our website and check out some of the great resources and opportunities that we have. Again, my name is Angie Furman, and I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for RMS. I'm here in Southwest Oregon today, and we'd love to know a little bit about who is joining us. So I encourage you to click that chat button on your Zoom toolbar and share in the chat who you are, why you're joining today, what kind of river work you do. And then I just want to share some expectations with everyone today that this is going to be an interactive session. It's not one of those just sit back and watch. We will have some portions of where we're sharing content and going through slides, but we will have some activities later on where we're going to be going into breakout groups and discussing some case studies. We'll have opportunities for question and answer along the way as well. So yeah, you'll be able to unmute, you'll be able to share in the chat. You've got those little like emojis to thumbs up or raise your hand, all sorts of things like that. I also just want to share a couple session agreements. Because this is interactive, we really encourage you to be here and be part of the conversation. Everyone's an expert in their different niche areas, so please share, speak up. And while you're speaking, at least it'd be great to see you on camera if possible, just help connect with one another. But you also have that chat. And then one of my favorites is it's okay to be raggedy as we're working through things today, because what's true today might not be true tomorrow, as well as learning is not always a clean process. Sometimes it takes getting raggedy to really start to understand some things. Now I want to introduce, we've got some presenters joining us today. Thanks to those who are introducing themselves in the chat. But I'd like our 3 presenters today to go ahead and introduce themselves. We'll go with Dave first, it's followed by Jim, and then John.
Okay, so I'm up.
Yep.
Okay, next slide.
No, introduce yourself, Dave.
Oh, introduce myself. Hi, my name is David Cernicek. I am the Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinator on the Bridger Teton National Forest. The designation is the Snake River Headwaters, which is 13 streams and 25 sections to designated sections of river as wild and scenic. From small streams in the Teton Wilderness to the big rolling Snake River Canyon with high, class 3 high velocity, big rapids and massive views.
Thanks, Dave. And for those who joined us at number 4 in our series, our last one in April, you might recognize Dave. All right, how about Jim?
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Jim McCartney with the National Park Service. I'm a river manager in the Park Service Wild and Scenic Rivers program. I'm based in Concord, New Hampshire, and I work chiefly on rivers in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And I'm also a member of the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Jim. And go ahead, John.
Hi, my name is John Field. I'm a fluvial geomorphologist or river geologist working on stream restoration and geomorphic assessments of rivers. I've worked on rivers around the country and around the world, including some work with the Wild and Scenic Rivers program.
Awesome. Well, thanks again to Dave and Jim and John joining us today. For those who are just joining, I'm going to be putting some links again into the chat that go to some handouts. I did want to note for that first link there is a password. That's what the PW in parentheses is. So you will have to enter that in to see that draft handout or that draft document. So with that being said, I think I'm going to pass it over to Dave to get us started.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. As I started to talk about earlier, out of a 416-mile designation, the Forest Service has 350 miles of designated shoreline. We have thousands of miles of eligible wild and scenic shoreline. This is a huge designation, and it has a huge interface with private lands and public roadways. Running along our riverbanks, we have federal highways, state highways, county roads, local roads, a lot of private pieces of land with very, very fancy houses and very sometimes persnickety landowners that paid a lot for that place and want to tear up the bank to destabilize it sometimes. So we do a lot of work in the Section 7 world in the years that we've been designated. And what we have is a project timeline on projects. It's really, really short and emotional. The requests typically come in right at the end of the summer, river seasons winding down, field season still going strong, fires are starting up, and everybody's busy and running crazy when it comes to employees in the building and specialists and such. Most of our forest specialists are spoken for a year ahead of time, and they have new demands like fires that are tapping any existing free time that they have, along with their other critical projects. When we get a Section 7 proposal, the bank project has to get done by the time the snow flies, and the bank exposure, the infrastructure will not survive another season in the spring, or at least that's what the proponent believes. So definitely comes in a time when you don't have a lot of resources and you're really well-meaning, but you can't fit it all in. I don't know if anybody else operates in that environment, but I do. Let's go to the next slide. I gotta move things around. We have to do Section 7 reviews. I do that function on my forest. I am very much not I don't consider myself a restoration specialist as much as I consider myself a coordinator, a orchestra coordinator, something like that. I manage people, and I work with proponents, agencies, consultants, everybody all the way through this type of thing. The relationships I manage are critical and important because, each time with all these agencies and folks, we will be coming back together again for the next Section 7. It may be a year, maybe 2 months, but we all have to get along together. And that's always a very hard thing to keep going if mainly because we have such different missions, and not everybody is focused on taking care of rivers. Other people are, want to put down a lot of highway or fix things or make things safer. And those things kind of conflict sometimes. So, I do know what the Wild and Scenic Act calls for. I know riprap is a no-no. I don't always know what bank stabilization technique is the best for the circumstances we are working to alleviate. It feels like I have the same proposed stabilization techniques sometimes that keep coming in that aren't really what the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act calls for. I know there's more compliant and successful designs, but I don't always know what they are or how to find them, and what is actually the best choice. I don't know if that sounds familiar to anybody. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. We do, I think most of us know the background of Section 7s if we've come this far and are talking about techniques more so. We do, if it's anything within a wild and scenic section, anything that is between the two ordinary high water marks requires a Section 7. And we have a lot of different conditions on our rivers, depending on whether it's classified as wild, scenic, and recreational. People generally get way too tied up in classifications, thinking it has something to do with the technique we're going to use or something like that. Classifications are only something that we put on rivers when they get designated as to the level of development that is around that river when it gets designated, not how we manage it in the future, or if we can treat it badly just because it has a recreational designation or classification, excuse me. But let's go to the next slide. Yeah. I see mostly the same repair technique over and over. You know, I see a lot of rock with willow shoots shoved in them and some soil on the top. Some things that are a lot better than that. There's a whole range of things out there, but there's obviously a lot better ways. More natural materials we can use. The easier it is to permit, the longer it'll hold together. But finding that person who has the knowledge of, you know, what bioengineering techniques are the best, you know, are hard. As I said before, we don't have our specialists. Even when there's better ways suggested, we have a lot of proponents and consultants that balk at them. You know, why do they balk? Ignorance. You know, the proponent doesn't know the difference between his neighbor and with the backhoe and the professional bank designer. There's always a fear of the unknown. People don't like to change, and riprap always appears to be the least cost, easiest to procure alternative. But these techniques, obviously, and on the slide you can tell, have much different futures when they finally come together and settle in, and it really affects the rest of the river. So let's go to the next slide. Where do we go from here? Today we're talking about a new tool designed to help with the well-meaning non-bank stabilization expert Section 7 participant to work through. What we're going to be doing today is seeing this tool. It's not released yet, but it's pretty fabulous. It's about understanding. It's about understanding river processes, and for the manager to understand when bank stabilization is needed or required. So it's selecting appropriate bank stabilization techniques and working through a few case studies using the tool and showing how the tool would be used. We don't always get to decide what comes in. The proponent decides on technique. Mostly we judge, and it's hard to greenlight questionable submissions. And we're here to help if you need us. So that's our focus today, is better bank stabilization. Thank you all for coming, and let's move it on over to John.
Great, good day. I have about 10 minutes to give you a crash course in river processes and bank erosion. Next slide. I'll try to do this by illustrating two basic adages. First, flowing water carries sediment, and rivers don't like fast changes. Starting with number one on the next slide. Flowing water carries sediment. Very simple. Just carry that with you because it'll help you in many instances. Just a little bit of a trickle of snowmelt runoff on a road can carry sediment. If you sprinkle some sand onto the pavement, that sand is going to start moving. Just a little bit of flowing water carries sediment. Next slide. So imagine what a big torrent of flowing water during a flood on a river can do. Next slide. Lots of flowing water can carry lots of sediment. So a small little trickle of a stream in the upper photo immediately before Tropical Storm Irene in 2011 in Vermont, less than a week later had turned into a giant wide river that had widened out completely because all of that flood water can carry lots and lots of sediment. Next slide. Not only sediment, but big sediment. That flood carried boulders, cobbles, trees, and even big chunks of sediment eating into the roadway. This road here in Mendon, Vermont is Route 4, the major east-west highway in Vermont. And so if we think about what do we do after the flood, next slide. Since there's no good place to reroute Route 4, basically the road had to be reconstructed in the same spot and the banks stabilized. We can talk about what technique to stabilize, but in this instance, bank stabilization needed to occur. But what about elsewhere? Next slide. Lots of the rivers in Vermont and neighboring states experience this extreme widening and erosion problems. And so where we have erosion in this photo, maybe we need to do stabilization by the house, if the house is even salvageable. But when we get out over into the fields, the question is, do we need to do bank stabilization? Is this erosion going to continue and become even worse? So to answer questions like that, we can sort of go back in history and see what happens after a large flood. Next slide. Here in Vermont, the last big flood prior to the 2011 event, at least in southern Vermont, was in 1973. Here on Roaring Branch, a tributary to the Battenkill, the large flood in 1973 created a very, very wide channel. And then the bulldozers came in after and pushed all the gravel to the side to create a berm you can see on the right side of the channel. On the next photo, we're going to be looking downstream from that railroad bridge you can see. And you can see the berm highlighted on the left. The channel was all the way out to the edge of that berm. Yeah, go back to that next slide. Next slide.
Dave, can you
Steinmark?
advance to the next slide?
Yeah, thank you. So we can see the channel extended all the way to the berm, but now that channel is much, much narrower. Oh, now we're going too fast.
Oh. Sorry, John, I think there's a delay that's affecting, so.
What's that?
There was a delay, so I'm on
okay.
slide 20 now, so let me know.
Yeah, that's good. So flowing water carries sediment, and a channel is sized to carry the flow and the sediment that flow can carry. The prevailing flows over time. So since large floods occur so infrequently, over time that this channel has narrowed down to the smaller, more prevailing flows. So the channel is getting smaller and smaller. That severe erosion we saw as a result of the large flood really has not continued. The channel has spent decades just filling in over time. Next slide. So when we see this dramatic erosion after a large flood, there's sort of the urge to sort of do something, like maybe we should stabilize. But the sort of point I'm making is that it actually might be decades before erosion occurs here again, if at all, because during those intervening years and decades, this bank will sort of self-stabilize itself without any action taken at all. So when we see erosion, we need to ask ourselves, what's going on here? Is this going to continue, or has the damage already been done, as is the case here after Tropical Storm Irene? Next slide. So now let's turn our attention to that other adage, rivers don't like fast changes. What do I mean by that? Next slide. On the left, you can see in plan view, rivers don't like fast right angle turns, as you see in the upper left here, but rivers rather develop smooth meanders where there's a little bit of turning everywhere, minimizing the amount of turning at any one point. On the right side, we see this rivers don't like fast changes illustrated in terms of changes in channel width. Rivers aren't narrow and then suddenly become quite wide and then neck down and narrow again very quickly. Rivers change width very slowly, minimizing the rate of expansion or contraction at any one point. Let me illustrate this in a couple of ways for the changes in width, just to give you an example of what I mean. Next slide. I'll sort of draw here just to illustrate some things. The upper Ammonoosuc River in New Hampshire has a very wide floodplain at this location, just drawing a line across the full width of the floodplain so you can see. But as we move downstream or down on the photograph, you'll see that the steep mountainsides, the multiple topo lines close together, representing rapid changes in elevation, you can see that the mountainsides are closing in on each other. So where I'm drawing the line now, you can see there's no floodplain at all. And so all of the water during a flood that's spread across the floodplain, as it approaches that valley constriction where the floodplain has disappeared, all of that water can't transition into that narrow spot instantaneously. So the water ponds up and waits its turn to pass through the constriction. Flowing water carries sediment, ponded water does not. So all of the sediment moving down the river as it approaches that constriction, that water stops, and so the sediment drops out. Next slide. And I'll clear my painting there. So we can see quite a bit of sediment is deposited upstream of that valley constriction. You can see those trees merging in the background from both sides of the valley. That's where that constriction was. All of that sediment is sort of forcing the river off to the side, and just trying to find my little drawer again here. So we can see all that sediment is kind of pushing the river into the opposite bank where we have erosion and meanders developing. Next slide. Sometimes that sediment fills in the channel so much that the channel just jumps out of the meanders and actually cuts the meanders off. The red dashed line is where the meander in the topographic map was, but later was cut off completely. And so the river is sort of flowing straight now right over the top of some riprap that was along the meander. Next slide. And so you can see the bank armor is actually in the middle of the river now because the river is just hopped right over. The point being, this valley constriction is very dynamic. The erosion is switching positions as a result of where the deposition is occurring. So next slide. So you can see the next generation of bank protection has been put down here, but now we understand this is a very dynamic area. Is this bank protection robust enough to withstand the forces that are in the area? So understanding that rivers don't like fast changes can help us understand how severe the erosion might be and how successful we might be in our stabilization efforts. Next slide. Now let me give you a human-induced example of this rivers don't like fast changes. Here we have a culvert replacement, but you'll see that the culvert is narrower than the width of the channel. So we have another fast change or another constriction in the stream. Next slide. So immediately upstream of that replaced culvert, they built some pools and riffles on the left for habitat improvement. But you can see that survived just for a few months because the first flood that came through here, all of the sediment being carried by the flow dropped out immediately upstream of the culvert where we had this ponding occurring. Again, flowing water carries sediment, ponded water doesn't. So we have all of this sediment burying our efforts to improve habitat. Next slide. Now the flowing water coming out of the culvert is not carrying any sediment immediately, but flowing water carries sediment. So downstream, you can see on the left, immediately after construction, the bank is stable. But then as a result of the flood, that flowing water wanting to carry sediment basically eroded the bank immediately downstream. Next slide. And again, the local public works department found this erosion alarming. Maybe there was no need to stabilize it, but there's that urge to stabilize things when we see it eroding. Now, all of these problems could have been avoided. Next slide. If they had not put an artificial fast change along the river system. If the culvert had been constructed to the full width of the channel, then the river would have been able to keep flowing and that sediment could have been kept in motion and in transport downstream, not creating this bottleneck problem. Next slide. So the overarching point here is that rivers don't have fast changes precisely because flowing water carries sediment. By having smooth meanders along the river system, the river has no fast change in the amount of flow, so that sediment can continue to move through the system unimpeded. This creates erosion and areas of deposition, but we need to understand that that erosion and deposition is perfectly natural. In fact, absolutely essential for the functioning of the river system. So next slide. So when it comes to stabilization, we don't have to worry about necessarily stabilizing everything. If we have an eroding bank in the middle of a wide corridor where there's no infrastructure, then perhaps we should think maybe we can get away without stabilizing this. But then where we're near infrastructure, we want to think about can we relocate that infrastructure, as in the case of the highway in the lower part of the image there. if we can relocate things, we can allow the river to continue its sort of natural process with unencumbered. But where we do have infrastructure, such as the homes in the upper right, that's a location where, in fact, we might need to consider bank stabilization. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Pass it over to Jim now.
Great, thanks, Angie, and thanks, John, for that great background on fluviogeomorphology. A lot to pack into a short period of time. We're going to move into talking a little bit about some of the products that the National Park Service has been working on for wild and scenic rivers and bank stabilization. Much of this work was done by John Field under a contract that we had with Field Geology Services and Jonas Consulting. As Dave mentioned earlier, we're putting together a package of materials, some guidance materials, to help people better understand river processes. So a lot of the kinds of things that John has been talking about, in order to help make decisions about the need for bank stabilization and what kinds of techniques we might want to use in a given situation. And the plan is to publish those materials, as Dave mentioned earlier, as part of the Park Service Natural Resource Report series, and then also make them available on rivers.gov. Next slide. So among those guidance materials, we've put together a series of fact sheets similar to this one here on topographic maps. This happens to be that example that John was showing from the upper Ammonoosuc River in New Hampshire. And it basically walks you through how do we use topographic maps to understand what we're seeing on the ground, and how can that inform decisions that project proponents, consultants, and wild and scenic river managers and others that are have a variety of roles in terms of reviewing and approving projects, Section 404 permits, that kind of thing. What kind of information do they want to bring to bear in considering some of those projects? So this is just one example. There's a few others that are part of that package, including looking at aerial photos, channel mapping, soil maps. So the Natural Resource Conservation Service has a series of soil maps that consider how fine-grained or coarse or hydric various soils might be, and that can we can use that information to inform what might be an appropriate treatment at a given site. There's another on topographic surveying. So a range of stuff. Next slide. And then in addition to that, we're developing fact sheets on some of the geomorphic concepts that John discussed earlier, including the concept of bank full, as well as things like alluvial versus non-alluvial channels, equilibrium, river response, that kind of the fast change thing that John was talking about, sediment transport. So that example of how sediment is carried by flowing water, how that increases as discharge increases. So there's a whole series of fact sheets on geomorphology as well. Next slide. So we can use that information to help us figure out what kind of a bank treatment to use at a given site. And again, this is something that river managers, regulators, landowners, project proponents might use to help figure out what's appropriate for a given setting. Next slide. So one of the things that we've done, in addition to fact sheets on resources that you might use to help evaluate the site and geomorphic processes, are just a two-page technique fact sheet for more than a dozen, almost 24 different techniques that that we might apply. So this is an example of engineered marginal log jams. If you go to the next slide, we put together a technique selection table that has this these 20 or so techniques that might be available for use. You have this as part of your handout. So go ahead and this is a little hard to read here. It's kind of small, but that you can look in your handouts and it's still in a draft form. At this point in time, we request that you not circulate this until this is actually published, but we want you to have something to give you an idea of what's in the works. So what this matrix shows is the appropriateness of various bank stabilization practices for a range of factors or site conditions. Those are listed across the top row there: flow, energy, bank position, what type of soil the bank consists of, what kind of a climate you're in, the degree of confinement for a channel, the slope of the bank, the setting, and then on the far right is the appropriateness for wild and scenic rivers. So generally, green indicates that the practice is appropriate for a given factor. Yellow is used if the technique is not always appropriate or better methods are available. And red indicates that the technique is generally not appropriate, but might be justified given specific site conditions. And sometimes it may be best to pair multiple practices for a given site. So for example, root revetments in the lower bank zone might be paired with bank reshaping and native plantings in the upper bank zone. And as you look at this and think about it and consider it, and we apply this to a couple of the case studies that we're looking at, the practices near the top of the matrix are likely to be more consistent with wild and scenic protections. So you can see it's mostly all green at the top, and then increasingly yellow and red as we move vertically down the table. So one of the things you'll see right at the top, the very top row, is doing nothing, taking no action. As John indicated, there are a number of situations where the damage is already done and nothing is likely to change within the next several decades. And so there may not be a need to undertake any action. Or conversely, we might think about doing some offsite measures. Maybe there's something that we can do upstream, removing a berm that's confining the channel upstream, and we could increase the storage of water offsite by doing something either upstream or downstream, dam removals, things of that nature. And then increasingly, as we're moving down, there are vegetative bioengineering methods, moving to wood, deformable bank treatments, and then hard armoring, rock or concrete. Next slide. So we also put together a decision matrix to kind of help consider those treatments that we were just looking at and figuring out which of these approaches to use. The red and green coloring here helps point out which approaches, again, might be more or less consistent with wild and scenic values. And this is structured to walk the user through a series of questions leading to an appropriate method. So the first question that you might ask is any infrastructure at risk or outstandingly remarkable values, those values for a given river that we might be looking to protect? Might be an archaeological resource, it might be recreation. There's a whole range of things that might come into play. Then asking the question, can we think about using vegetation to successfully provide stability to the bank, recognizing that the roots that woody vegetation has provide much of the bank's stability. The cohesiveness for those soils is really provided by that root structure. We'll think about things like what erosive forces are present, whether or not wood-based treatments might be viable, and is the setting appropriate for other approaches like deflection structures. Next slide. So with that, I think we're going to move into looking at some case studies. This will give you an opportunity to put into practice some of the things that hopefully you've taken home from John's crash course in fluvial geomorphology, the two handouts that we just covered on the last two slides, the decision matrix, as well as the table of different treatments that might be available. But before we head there, we'll just take a couple of minutes to answer any questions that you might have before we move into the case studies themselves.
And if you have those questions, you can type them in the chat. You can raise your hand like Matt has done. Go ahead, Matt.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
I was just curious if from some of the examples you were showing from the 1970s with the intervention with bulldozers and channelizing rivers in a dramatic response to try to control the visual erosion and act in some direct way. Have you seen much of a difference over time? Are you seeing a better response from different interventions, or what is your perspective on the learning curve about fluvial geomorphology and appropriate responses to riverbank stabilization in general in the United States?
There's a growing change in the way rivers are managed, especially in Vermont. The response from the 1970s compared to after Tropical Storm Irene, I wouldn't say is completely different. There was still a lot of rock armoring and perhaps even some berming in some locations in the region, just sort of immediate response. But before and after the actual Tropical Storm Irene, there were things going on that sort of changed. That berm I was showing you from the 1970s was blocking flow from entering a campground area. And that flow was being sent directly into a high bank that was eroding. So the response from the 1970s flood was the berming was causing another problem downstream. And in fact, the state of Vermont prior to Tropical Storm Irene had already removed portions of that berm I showed you on that photograph, and that allowed some of that flow to escape and presumably cause less damage elsewhere by not sort of hurtling it downstream. Also, that took 50 years to remove that 1970s berm. As a result of Tropical Storm Irene, they did do some unauthorized berming, and in Massachusetts, I'm thinking of, and the state of Massachusetts actually had those berms removed so they wouldn't sort of send that flow downstream, but allow it to spread out and cause less damage over time. So we are seeing some changes in the way things are being managed in that 50-year time difference.
And I guess what do you think accounts for that change? Education, awareness from different conservation groups, pressure from different conservation groups, more engagement with and better knowledge from consultants and engineers, or is there a change in awareness from some of the regulating authorities as well?
All of the above, but I'll boil it down to one word: fish. Fish habitat, especially the Pacific Northwest with endangered salmon species. But even in Vermont, where sort of sport fishing is popular, just a desire to see improved fish habitat as a proxy for aquatic habitat overall. But fish are sort of the stars of the show in terms of river recreation and fishing, etc. So all that you mentioned is true, but the reason for those changes is really the fish and trying to improve the fisheries.
With your upcoming guidance documents that you're preparing, is there a process for engagement with regulatory authorities on that, or will they just be posted on the rivers.gov website for viewing by interested parties, or is there more to it than that to that process for engagement in any way?
Yeah, we did solicit input from various folks as we were developing some of this material. It's really, we're kind of coming down the finish line, so the opportunities for additional engagement are not really so much there at this point in time. But good question, Matt. Thanks.
Well, I haven't seen any other questions in the chat either, so I think we should maybe move into our case studies. We're gonna have time. Our plan is we're gonna do a little introduction of the case study, then we'll move into breakout rooms, then we'll discuss, come back together, talk about possible answers to some of the prompts, and then do a second case study. So we'll be coming back and forth, and then hopefully save a little bit of time at the end to answer any other questions, or at least share info, because I know this is, there's so much information to pack into this 90 minutes that I'm sure that the presenters wouldn't mind if you follow up with them. So Jim, I think you're taking on the first case study, and I did put a link in the chat to a handout to that as well.
Okay, great. Thanks. So we're going to look at a proposed bank stabilization project, and just going to provide you with a little background, some photos, some very simple designs for this particular project. And your job is to kind of evaluate the material that you have in front of you. It's not super complicated, but before we go into the breakout rooms, we'll walk through this, kind of lay out some stuff, and then if you have any questions that you want to raise before we go into breakout rooms, that will be your chance to ask any follow-ups, and then we'll give you a little chance to kind of dive in deeper. So in this particular project, I imagine that you receive an emergency application for a bank stabilization project along a wild and scenic river. This could be any river, but let's think, this is part of the wild and scenic series, so we'll look at it from that perspective. The applicant states that the bank is eroding and threatening the adjacent river road. They're proposing to place either concrete blocks or large boulders at the toe of slope, and then fill the bank itself up the bank slope with 15-inch to 42-inch sized rock, and then grout over the rock with concrete to solidify the bank stabilization measures. In this particular case, the ORVs for this wild and scenic river are culture ecology, geology, recreation, and scenery. Next slide. So this just gives you a an aerial photo of the site. You can see it's a fairly sizable channel, large bridge, and then the project location is right there in the center of the photograph, marked by the yellow pin. Next slide. So here's a couple of photos of the site. It's not a huge area. These are taken from top of bank at the road edge, looking at the guardrail, which has become undermined, and then down to the toe of slope and the channel beyond. Next slide. So the shot on the left is looking back up the bank from the toe of slope, and then kind of an oblique view, the photo on the right looking downstream. Note the condition of the bank, the gullying, the materials at the toe of bank in the photo on the right. Next slide. This just provides a general overview of what the proposed remedy is, how many square feet of impact, that kind of thing. Next slide. And then sort of a more detailed description of what's being proposed. They're showing some large boulders at the toe of slope, and then vegetated riprap protection going up the slope to top of slope where the guardrail is. And then next slide. So any questions or info that you feel like you might need? I think, I'm not sure if this is in your handout or not. I'm thinking that it is a list of questions that you might want to be considering. Looking closely at the photos, what do you notice at the base of the bank, the toe of slope in photos 2 and 4? What do you notice about the vegetation upstream and downstream of where that erosion and gullying are? Are you able to discern the sources of erosion or contributing factors by looking at the photos? Is any infrastructure or ORVs at risk? What is the presence of the sandy soils at the toe of slope suggest about the need to stabilize the bank? Is the proposed solution, the proposed activity, addressing the real source of the problem? And what other techniques might you consider for this particular site? I think there were a couple of questions that came in as I was going through that list of questions. Who's proposing the intervention? It's the highway department. And then the regulatory authority, yes, Army Corps of Engineers. This will require a 404 permit. And as Angie pointed out, you can find the questions in the handouts. So before we break into groups, any additional questions that folks might have, you can either put them in the chat or raise your hand. Endangered species, I think there is long-eared yeah, the bat, the long-eared bat. So that might be a timing thing if there's any tree vegetation that's slated for removal. And then Darren.
Yeah, howdy, Jim. Is that river free flowing? It looks like maybe slow or like it's a large pond, but hard to tell just from the photo. Can you just kind of paint that greater picture?
It is free flowing. It's a large river and it's slow moving in this particular location, certainly at this flow level. other questions that folks have before we go into breakout? We want to make sure you're well armed. All right, Angie.
I did see Travis ask high water mark or level? Question mark.
I think ordinary high water would be, I'm not sure that it was shown on that schematic. I think it's probably several feet up the bank from toe of slope. The 100-year flood elevation actually overtops the roadway.
Good questions. All right. I'm going to send everyone off into breakout groups. You should automatically go, and then I'll bring you all back. All right. And you all might be the group that's staying in this room. Yes, you are. This is one of the breakout groups. So
Excellent.
everyone.
Everyone.
Angie, I totally had that feeling like, oh, why am I staying here? Uh-oh.
I would only expect a solution like that to be proposed from a highway department, but they're obviously not looking at the root of the problem at all. They haven't, you know, so I think given that the erosion is occurring on the inside of the bend of a river, which is the first key that you know, we're not really dealing with scour or anything like that. It's all about a drainage issue that's coming from the highway itself, right? So an appropriate intervention, I think, would be, you know, to start from that perspective and simply look at an effective drainage alternative there for that site, and to manage things with stormwater and runoff, and would help a lot.
Why do you think it's what else besides the inside bend position sort of cluing you into what's on the photographs, I guess? What else is leading you to think it's a drainage problem from above as opposed to a scour problem from below?
Well, you also, I think, John, you made some great comments, I think, about how moving water moves sediment, and flat water does not. And I think there was a comment following up to that by one of the participants that the river looks somewhat like a lake or an impoundment there, because it's very, very flat. We're not seeing a very high energy environment there that's going to be creating active erosion along the bank. When we look at the photos in the handout, I think we can see that there is evidence of you know, active runoff that's eroding even the asphalt on the road is coming off of the road there, and we're even seeing evidence in photo 443. We're seeing that the type of erosion we're looking at is from the runoff off of the road. Right? We're not seeing evidence that the toe of the slope is really actively eroding up to the road.
In fact, what do you see at the toe of slope? Those photos in particular that were called out.
Well, it's more of the accumulation of all of everything that's coming off the road and running down that slope, and it's eroding, and it's settling right there along the shoreline, right? Accumulating.
You can
Is
see
it-
fine channel erosion happening from the top of that road down the vertical slope and then through the sediment toe. So it's clear that things are moving from the top of the road to the river itself and not the length of the river.
Right, I would argue that it's more than just the sediment coming down that gully that's putting the sediment there at the base of slope. I think it's more extensive than that. Some of the photos show it's almost a beach of fine sediment all along the bank, not just in the immediate area where the gully is. So sort of driving home the points you've been making, that it's not just scour at the base. I mean, there doesn't seem to be much scour. Not only does the river not look very energetic, I'd argue that's low flow. We don't know what it looks like at high flow. But the fact that we have all that sediment accumulating as a beat sort of in my mind's a strong indication that we don't have these sort of erosive scouring flows at this location, at least, even at high flow. So moving to solutions, you kind of touched on it a little bit, Matt, I guess, but their solution's not proper. Their solution of large rocks at the toe of bank is not necessarily the end of the world. It's number one, maybe not consistent with wild and scenic river values from the aesthetic standpoint alone. So maybe it's not going to do any harm in terms of the erosion problem, but it's not really addressing the erosion problem, which is, as you're suggesting, sort of a drainage problem from up above. So I don't know if it would do any good to get practice of going through. I don't know if you have in front of you the decision matrix. We could sort of step through that and see where we might end up with in this particular situation. I think the first question is there any infrastructure at risk? Sort of getting to the point I was making, maybe we shouldn't even be thinking of bank stabilization if there's no infrastructure at risk. But in this case, what's your answer to that first question?
Resounding yes. It's like there's a road.
There's a road, right? Or the
They're losing the road.
guardrail is caving in. So yes, I think there's infrastructure that we should be concerned about. Then the next question, I think, I don't have it in front of me. If you do, correct me, but I think the next question is there any off-site measures? Meaning, is there something we can do off of the riverbank itself which might alleviate the problem or lessen the problem?
But well, we don't really have the whole view. I mean, when I look at these types of examples, I would say first let's step back and look at the whole scenario. We don't know if there's a housing development that's right off the side there out of the view that's contributing to that flow, or if it's just a natural flow and from rainwater and stormwater runoff that's coming off this slope of the highway, and we don't know even what the slope of the highway looks like. When we haven't.
No, exactly. We are somewhat limited. But the fact that we've identified that it's not the river itself or scour at the base of the bank that's a problem, we've sort of focused on the, I'll call it off-site drainage issues, off-site being away from the river, even if it's just up the bank a little bit. But I think we're sort of zeroing in we don't know what those offsite measures would be because we're somewhat limited in the information we have. But I think it's fair to say that that's what we're going to be looking for, is can we fix the drainage in such a way that it's not focused in on this area, things like that. So I think that's a resounding yes in terms of at least we want to look for offsite measures.
Well, I think in the time we have remaining, probably less than 30 seconds, it's I would suggest that as maybe when we go back with the main group, I think it'd be a great exercise to go through the handout and just go through that decision-making tree as a group. I think would be a great benefit for everyone just to see how we're using that handout. Yeah, I just say I'm confronted by these types of problems all the time. And the biggest problem I have is that there are a lot of international finance banks that like to justify resources, spending money on these types of interventions that aren't really appropriate. And there's a very lucrative, there's a whole group of development actors that benefit from these things. And outside of the United States, we have a big problem with this type of thing without the transparency and controls that are needed. But
yeah, I couldn't agree more on that one.
All right, everyone should be starting to trickle back in here from the other rooms.
We had the suggestion in my breakout group that it might be beneficial if we walk through the decision matrix sort of all the way through. I'd suggest we do that after the next case study, which given the nature of it might sort of naturally take us further down the decision matrix than the last example.
So is there somebody from any one of the breakout groups that wants to briefly, in a minute or less, sort of summarize what your consensus evaluation might have been in terms of what's going on and what potential measures you might think about applying? I'll start with it. Is there anybody from the group number 2 that I was in that wants to volunteer? Darren, can I put you on the spot?
You can, if you repeat the question. I had to step out for a sec.
I was just wondering if you wanted to volunteer what the sort of consensus from the breakout group was in terms of what you saw happening at the site and what potential solution you might be thinking about.
Yeah, we'd rip wrap and slurry everything. Kidding. We think that the source of the problem is probably up above steep slope, and maybe it's a point erosion kind of thing coming off of that roadway. We did not think it was actually a river induced erosion problem. So we're looking at, to remedy that, to protect that infrastructure and to stay out of the riverway, although you'd still be within the 100-year flood, as you pointed out, Jim. Maybe a wall, something up high that will retain the guardrail and that roadway, stabilizing it under the highway and not going down with riprap and concrete. That was a quick overview.
Any thanks, Darren. Any contrary analysis from any of the other groups or different suggestions?
if we can pull that road back a little bit from the area, it would be super helpful after then we can do our intervention on the bank and stabilize things.
I don't know if we'd be able to pull the road back, but if we couldn't, I like that idea, but if we couldn't because of the home's so close by, what about doing like geolifts right off the side of the road, the guardrails? We've done those. Guardrails can go into the geolift, so it's a little bit more naturalized. But they'd have to go super deep because that's a very steep slope.
Yeah.
Great observation.
Well, Jim, for the sake of time, do you want me to go to some of the possibilities?
Sure. Did you have those on a
Sorry, I missed that.
slide,
He
Angie?
responded.
Okay, great, thanks. So part of the reason why there were not a lot of specifics on this particular scenario is it's still under review. This is a real world scenario. We're thinking about possible design changes, including addressing roadway drainage. We've identified that the grouted riprap that Darren wants to, extend an additional 100 feet upstream and downstream on the bank is not going to be acceptable. Laura, you'll be pleased to see there was some conversation about fabric encapsulated soil lifts. We didn't know at that time what the 100-year elevation was, and that was actually overtopping the roadway. I think it probably doesn't, you could probably go with the 25-year storm and use FES from that point up and end up with a decent result. Oftentimes what we do in the Park Service, at least in the Northeast region, is making sure that loam is not used below ordinary high water, because it's there's a frequent enough back and forth with flow that a lot of that material just gets washed out of voids when riprap is choked with that. So below ordinary high water, we typically like to see those materials, any riprap that gets used, choked with sand and gravel, basically the native bed materials. And we're also often looking for riprap that's not fractured. So we're looking for subangular to subrounded stone. Above ordinary high water, and again, but for the steepness of this slope, I think we would not be looking at riprap at all. We'd just be looking for bank reshaping and vegetative measures, doing some plantings, some live stakes, things of that nature. And the other factor at this particular site is the infrastructure potentially at risk, the roadway, and motorist safety, that kind of thing. Otherwise, in this site, we'd be looking to choke that with loam, provide opportunity for seeding, and then woody vegetation to establish on the slope. It's certainly successful upstream and down. There's no indication that it's a problem for vegetation to become established. And then we're looking to make sure there's no invasives as part of the mix. And one of the things that we like to see is the use of straw, not hay, just because of the seeds and the potential for invasives to come in with that. So that's where we're at on that. And I think I'll hand it over to John.
Yeah, and John, as you're getting started, I'm going to suggest, for the sake of time, that we just do this next case study all together instead of going into breakout groups.
Yep, sounds good. So Jim was coy and not indicating where the last one was. He did suggest it was the northeastern United States. So we will switch gears and go to the northwestern United States and look at a case study on the Nooksack River in Whatcom County, Washington. Next slide. Just to be clear, this is not on a wild and scenic river, just trying to exemplify the bank erosion issue. However, the Nooksack River is in discussions, at least locally, to become a wild and scenic river. So maybe one day it will be. Next slide. Next slide. Is it coming?
Dave, can you try advancing? I'm not sure if we've lost Angie.
Here she comes.
I'm back. Yeah, I got logged off. Trying to get it up. Internet is struggling today, everyone. Sorry, and I apologize. I'm trying to share my screen right now. It's loading.
Yeah, good. So here's the bank erosion problem. This is actually a problem from the mid 1990s. But this eroding bank on the Nooksack was at least locally threatening a raspberry farm. And while raspberries are yummy, it's perhaps not worthy of attention for a case study. But in this case, there's more going on here. This is a rare instance where the top of the bank is actually a drainage divide. Next slide. So water overtopping this bank is actually entering the Sumas River system, which is actually flowing on into Canada. So when the Nooksack River is flooding, the floodwaters are not only heading out to the west, but they are also heading north on the Sumas River and into Canada, where in the 1990s, actually 1990 itself, there was a large flood. Next slide, which caused extensive damage in Canada, including closing off the Trans-Canadian Highway for a time. So the problems at this erosion problems is feeding into an international sort of flooding problem. Next slide. So with that international sort of component to this, there was a lot of interest in how to stabilize this riverbank. And in the end, they decided on using deflectors and concrete, sort of dolo jack-shaped concrete configurations to create deflector structures. And on a second bend downstream, which I won't get to today, they also built a log deflector structure. So the whole reason for approving this project was to do some experimental efforts and seeing which types of deflector structures might work best. Next slide. So here's just some other images of those deflector structures from the air. Also a close-up showing you these concrete dolos that ended up catching a lot of wood on them. This is in the Pacific Northwest with endangered salmon species at play. You can see in the upper right photo a lot of sediment accumulating between the deflector structures. The deflector structures are sort of pushing the water away or diverting the water away from the eroding bank. Next slide. Further problems. So anyway, I'll just set up that what we'll see here now is an aerial photograph taken shortly after the project was completed. The project was completed in 1997, this aerial from 1998. You can see the little white tick marks, if you will. Those are the deflector structures. But now we have the value of 25 years hence, or 23 years. We can look at the 2021 aerial photograph and see what's happened along the river and whether this project might have had anything to do with what happened along the river since that time. So as we move into a large breakout group, all of us together, you should be able to call up a handout or another presentation which has the 1998 and 2021 photographs, one on top of the other. And I'd like you just to spend a few minutes trying to find the stabilized bank in 2021, number one, and number two, try to highlight some of the changes you see. Just sort of work on your own for a minute, but then after a couple minutes, if people want to start chiming in, going, "Oh, I see this, I see that," that'll be great. And those red stars are meant to help you orient yourself since things have changed quite a bit. You can
I
sort of
just
use
say, as like
those
first
to-
thoughts, I think it's so cool that we can see a case study for the 23 years and just like the river wants to do what the river wants to do clearly here. And I like the red stars where you can really see like, all right, we're protecting our assets farther away, but we're letting the stream do its thing in the center here. It's really neat.
Have you been able to find the deflector structures on the 2021 photo?
Kind of like where they're supposed to be anyway.
Yes, exactly. Did the bank stabilization work? Did the bank erode any further from that perspective? Did it work?
Not from where the structures were.
Yeah,
Correct, where the bank has stayed in the same place. I should point out that as that bank was eroding, since the land is sloping away from it, the height of the bank gets lower and lower and lower, and that means more and more water will spill over it over time. So by stopping it, they haven't made the overflow problem into Canada any worse. I should point that out. But you see a lot of river movement away from the protected bank. It's sort of all vegetated in now where the protected bank was. Let's see, I can use my little art drawing tools here, maybe. So here's where the bank stabilization was, all vegetated in. And we've seen a lot of river movement to the left. This whole meander here is kind of new. Main channel, if you look really closely at the 1998 photo, you'll see that where the main channel is now, there was a little bit of a side channel there, so it sort of opened that up dramatically. Did the bank stabilization effort in any way play a role in this movement of the channel off in this direction, or is that just how this river operates?
Well, I think it seems like it did not really come into play at all because, well, you know, first of all, we have to look at the overall geology of the area. This is an alluvial floodplain area, right? Which is maybe one of the most important aspects to consider at the beginning, and that accounts for the you know, the major channel shift that we saw upstream, which is out of sight in this view that we're looking at. And it's unclear to me what might have been done upstream to influence that change in the main channel that shifted from the river right side over to the river left side. That's the main reason why I see the river channel shifting predominantly towards the river left side in the 2021 view, and the reason why basically all the interventions made previously just you know, kind of you know, were marginalized and out of the picture over time.
Yeah, this is a very dynamic part of the river. This river is shifting its position dramatically with or without the bank stabilization effort. However, this is a very sensitive river and little things can have a big difference. And by putting those deflector structures into the river, we're creating sort of roughness and a slight obstruction, and that could potentially be backwatering the river ever so slightly upstream. And so that side channel I pointed out on the 1998 photo, which is now really the main flow path, we could have elevated the water upstream of the deflectors just enough to sort of really let that happen. So the deflector structures, in my mind, might have played a small role in nudging the river over. Not that it couldn't have happened without the deflector structures, but just the timing of when the deflector structures were built and when these changes started happening. Just that timing is so close that I'm actually going to give a little bit of credence to the fact that the deflector structures might have caused that. It doesn't look like that new erosion on the left side of the photograph is threatening any infrastructure, but these are the types of things you need to be careful and ask yourself, what could be the impact of what I'm doing, and could it be causing a problem elsewhere? So those are questions to ask about. I think with a limited time available, if there's any time available, is to ask, is this deflector structure sort of a wild and scenic river type of activity we'd like to see, or is there another way we could have built these structures, or another type of structure that would have been more consistent with a wild and scenic river system? Again, Nooksack is not a wild and scenic river, at least yet, but I think this provides an example to ask these types of questions.
Yeah, and I will just say, I know we are kind of at our time. I'm happy to stay after, but I do just, for those who might need to run, I just want to say, this is just 90 minutes that we've been trying to pack this into, and I apologize, my camera's off, but I think it's making everything a little smoother right now. But we are doing a 3-day course with a 4th day optional virtual field trip in November, where we're going to be diving into fluvial geomorphology, a whole ton. And I encourage you to go check out, I'm going to put a link in the chat to a webpage that has a ton more information about it, where you can go find more. So
My 10-minute crash course wasn't enough. 3 days probably will be too much.
If there's time for a question,
Yeah, go ahead.
John was you were mentioning about the deflectors that were used, and it seems to me that if the intent was to try to shift that channel or redirect some of that energy in a different direction, those types of deflector structures may not be the best option to use, and some type of J-hook intervention with better angles and a hydraulic design profile design could have been maybe more effective without maybe leading to the influences you mentioned might have pushed the river channel towards the river left side upstream. Any comments on that?
I don't remember at the time. I was living in the area at the time this was being designed. I don't really remember at the time any discussions of the river being shifted over. It was all about sort of keeping high velocity flows off the bank. So it was really sort of the near term solution. There wasn't much consideration of the larger potential effect. I think looking at it 23 years or 25 years later, it really should open your eyes to the fact that what you're doing in one spot could have an effect somewhere else. So even if your concern is to protect that immediate bank, you really need to be thinking bigger picture and what could happen. I think I can let Jim speak to this better, but just my sense with sort of deflector structures within the wild and scenic river context is deflector structures aren't sort of a very natural thing. You don't really see that type of thing naturally out on a river system. They do work pretty effectively to stop the erosion, and there's J-hooks and deflectors and groins and bendway weirs. These all sort of come in different names and flavors, and while there are maybe subtle differences in their design, they're all essentially after the same thing to sort of divert water away from the riverbank. But I'll give Jim a minute to talk further about sort of how these tie in with wild and scenic rivers.
Yeah, I think just quickly on that, a slightly different approach, but similar might have been to use engineered log jams instead of the dolos. So that would have been more consistent with wild and scenic protections, the use of naturally occurring materials, even though the structures themselves as deflectors, as John described, are not necessarily found or in the kind of spacing and arrangement or position that those deflectors were introduced into the Nooksack. We certainly see log jams, natural log jams on most rivers that have forested banks on one side or another, right? And the persistence of those varies with time. And obviously, if there was some critical infrastructure at that particular location they were looking to protect, that might be a really good way to both protect the infrastructure and encourage the higher velocities, the stronger shear forces to be farther off the bank in that particular location. Again, as John was pointing out, not necessarily trying to shift the channel per se, but at least retard or arrest the lateral migration at that particular location where infrastructure or some other value might be threatened.
I've got thanks. I just want to say thanks to John, Jim, and Dave for this. I know these issues are complex and each case presents its own its own problems. Um, I, I feel like even though I've been in this realm for years, there's still this underlying question of like, ultimately, are hard armoring bank stabilization permitted in a wild and scenic river corridor? It's crazy to be able to have to ask that question at this point in time, but I feel like it still comes up. We have rivers that follow highways and major, interstate, state highways, and yeah, it would be great to put log jams in a lot of places, but it's not, it doesn't always come to be like the best solution. And so, or the easy solution for sure. I guess I'll just have to look to Jim being on the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Council. Can you definitively say no that hard armoring bank stabilization is not permitted in a wild and scenic river corridor?
I think the answer is yes, we can say that. I think the answer is also more nuanced, as you point out. So Dave kind of differentiated between the various classifications, wild, scenic, and recreational, and suggested that for many of these projects or activities that might occur, the act is blind to classification, and I don't disagree. That said, let me give this a little bit of nuance, which is what the existing conditions were and what those classifications are reflective of is what the level of development was at the time the river was designated. And if a particular river was classified as wild when it was designated because there are no stream crossings, there are no roads paralleling, there are no trails, that kind of thing, I think if there is a proposal to put a hardened structure in that setting, that is arguably inconsistent, completely inconsistent with the wild character of that particular river. It's also the case that, and we see this particularly in my part of the country, where we've got a high density drainage network and a high density infrastructure network, that the road stream interactions are frequent, and that a lot of our designations here are scenic or recreational designations, and the act allows for some amount of bank armoring. Bank armoring and stream crossings don't eliminate eligibility for inclusion in the system, which means we can end up with scenarios where we have hardened banks existing on the day that the river becomes wild and scenic. And no matter the solution that's out there, over time, and I think some of John's slides pointed this out well, often these rigid solutions are flanked or fail in a variety of settings, and that sometimes the less rigid alternatives actually outperform the more rigid alternatives. So when we have something like that, existing infrastructure, the highway that parallels the wild and scenic river, there's likely over time to be scenarios where there's a need to do something. And I think what we're making the case for and trying to provide to partners, to river managers, to designers, project proponents is a more robust and diverse palette of solutions that can be applied in a given situation.
Thanks for that, Jim. And so if the Nooksack were a designated wild and scenic river and that project had not been built with the concrete deflectors, would you say definitively that concrete deflectors would not be permitted as a management tool for this bank stabilization in a designated wild and scenic river or an eligible wild and scenic river?
I'm not going to go there because I know for a fact on a wild and scenic river in the Pacific Northwest, one of the river administrative agencies allowed concrete dolos for a bank protection project. And I think, but by the way, I think it had a favorable result in that particular situation. That said, I think I would just add that engineered log jams might have worked equally well, and I would argue would have been more consistent with the wild and scenic designation. I think you know, a couple of things. There was a question, and I apologize not remembering who asked it, but what has changed over time in terms of our understanding and what we're doing. I think one of the things that has changed over time is, frankly, the science of or the practice of river restoration and the science of fluvial geomorphology and related disciplines has advanced greatly in the last several decades. And I think we have more tools and experience at our disposal than we did a few decades ago. And we have, as you know, this Nooksack example points out, the ability of a couple of decades of time to see what the response of these channels are to some of the solutions we're putting on the ground, and to better understand how some of that may work or not, as the case may be.
I should point out, I think I alluded to it, that this Nooksack River project, this was done by Whatcom County. They were sort of your standard riprap everything engineers, but this is about the time when the salmon were being listed on the Endangered Species Act. So the Washington Fish and Game and basically said, no, you're not going to riprap this as your solution, come up with some alternatives. And in addition to the deflectors, they said, well, we want to see different materials being used. They used rock, they used wood on another bend I didn't show you. And then they were looking for a third way to do it. And so this concrete dolo idea came along, and using concrete, Washington Fish and Game was very concerned. They weren't really into the idea of the concrete dolos. Turns out in the end, they actually like the dolos quite a bit, and maybe why it's being used elsewhere in Washington today, because compared to the rock, at any rate, there's a lot of gaps and spaces in the concrete dolos, and so you had a lot of water sort of jetting through, which the fisheries people liked quite a bit. And I also showed you the one slide where it was trapping a lot of wood, a lot of extra cover and whatnot. I would argue log jams, depending on the way they're constructed, would have that same effect of jets of water passing through and more effectively trapping wood. So within the wild and scenic river setting, maybe the log jams would be better in the dolos from that perspective. But I just wanted to point out that at least the fisheries people were pleasantly surprised at how the dolos were working, at least in that sort of micro habitat sense.
Been some really good discussion, and really appreciate that. I did put Jim, John, and Dave's contact info into the chat, and I put it in again, so it's easier to actually read. And so you can always reach out to them. You can reach out to me. I just want to say thanks again to them for sharing their knowledge today, and for everyone else who joined and stayed through. So thanks everyone, and hope to see you at another RMS webinar, maybe our Wild and Scenic one next month on visitor use management on Wild Scenic Rivers. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Yeah, stay
Thank you, everybody.
tuned.
Thanks, everyone.